interpreted thusly and whatever, and at least there'll be some sort of, and then you can go from there. What do you think? I mean, I'm just suggesting.
Have been about thought.
You mean where we went?
Yeah.
Enough to do a lot. You know, there's, I even could use the word revolutionary. Yeah. Oh, well, that's wonderful.
All right, everything okay?
Yeah. 10 seconds. Okay. We'll just wait for all the other conversations to. Yeah. So I guess the best way to begin is to say that I know we're old friends, and old friends don't usually sit with one of them having notes on his lap to have a conversation, but this is a special occasion, and I want to thank you for sitting down here this way. And so I hope you'll forgive the impropriety if I read from some of these notes.
It's all right.
I have prepared some questions.
Yes.
The first question is, some people might find it unusual for a theoretical physicist to have an interest in things like consciousness and the thinking process. But in fact, your work reflects a growing involvement with these and associated subjects over a period of many years. When did this interest begin? How and why has it become such an important aspect of your present work? And can what you now explore still be considered physics, theoretical or otherwise?
Yes, well, I think implicitly my interest in consciousness began very early, but the earliest incident that I can recall happened about at the age of 11 or 12, I can't remember, but I was with some boys and we were in the mountains near Wilkes-Barre, crossing a rather rapidly flowing stream. And
that's in Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania.
In the States. Huh?
That's right, and there were a lot of rocks we had to cross on. They were rather far apart and very small, and you couldn't just step across them, and I felt very apprehensive. It seemed a new situation. But I suddenly realized you had to jump from one to the other without stopping in between, that you were in a state of movement, pivoting on one rock while you moved to the next. Whereas I'd usually thought of going from one step to another. I was mapping out the steps.
And generally that's the way you functioned up until
yes,
that point?
Well, I think people generally did, a lot of them.
In other words, you think before you
Well, you try to map it out a bit, and it's more secure and so on. But see, here was a case that wouldn't work, and you had to do it from moment to moment. Then after that, I felt that it made a deep impression on me that this theme has recurred a lot in my work. You know, that your consciousness is going moment by moment of awareness, and not mapped out.
Do you recall that coming back again later, before you even went into physics?
Well, I can't remember. You know, I don't really recall a lot of my childhood.
I see.
But I think this was combined with some tendency to want to go beyond limits. You see, when I was in this small city of Wilkes-Barre, you see the nearest towns around it were called Ashley, Sugar Notch, and Warrior Run. So that's all I knew. I mean, I didn't know them, but I knew about them. So then we went for a ride beyond Warrior Run. It seemed like going beyond the world, you see.
I see.
And so I had this notion of, see, people talked about the world, and I said, where does it end? And
what answer did they give?
Well, I don't remember. It wasn't terribly convincing, I suppose. So I think that notion used to fascinate me. I remember in third grade, perhaps, there was a sort of a Nordic folk tale of about some place which was east of the sun and west of the moon. The idea being that it was beyond all limits. And that idea always fascinated me. So I think that was combined. You see that I didn't really want to stay within limits, you see. And this was combined with my interest in consciousness, I mean, which was mostly implicit at that time. I mean, I didn't very often think about it explicitly.
What period of time was that in
What?
chronologically? It was about the 20s or the 30s?
It was in the 20s, yeah.
The 20s. So the Depression hadn't yet...
No, it hadn't come yet.
Do you recall the Depression years?
Oh, yes. Well, yes, I recall them, you know, that there was a great deal of unemployment and suffering, and people were out of jobs, and banks were failing.
And you were in a coal mining area.
In a coal mining area there, and people were talking about things getting very bad, you know, even revolution.
Really?
And then Roosevelt came in, and he produced all these new measures which gave people hope, you see. And I think they lifted things up a little bit and gave people some hope that at least it would get better. But I was I became very interested in politics because I thought, you know, we've got to do something about this sort of thing, you see, as well as about the growing danger of war, you know, with people like Mussolini and Hitler.
And still your interest in science was developing along with that?
Yes, it was. And I became, you know, I became interested. I used to go to the public library with a friend of mine. We'd get books on chemistry and physics and so on and study them. I read the Scientific American about atomic power. I read science fiction. The idea of atomic power fascinated me. I thought that that would be a solution, I mean, unlimited energy. But anyway, your question was originally how I got into consciousness.
Right. Right.
So I think that I remember in college once raising myself the question, are we totally determined or are we free, you see? And is our consciousness free or is it determined like a machine? But at that time I concluded it didn't matter as long as we at least could feel free to do what we wanted.
I see.
So, but later, I think, you see, when we came to study quantum mechanics, when I was at Berkeley in California with Oppenheimer, there were friends there who were very interested in Niels Bohr. Now, Niels Bohr had called attention to an analogy between thought and quantum mechanics, that in quantum mechanics, whenever you observe something, you change it in an unpredictable and uncontrollable way. You can't analyze it. Now, if you try to look at your thought process, it changes too. That is, if you try to define your thought, it becomes unclear where it's going. If it's going somewhere, then you're sort of in momentum, then you don't define it. This was very similar to the behavior of the electron in quantum theory. So I felt there might be some connection between consciousness and physics there.
Later on, when you wrote your book on quantum theory, you actually did introduce
Yes,
that.
I brought that idea up, yes.
And that was in 1952?
1951, yes.
51.
Well, it was published in...
And then in the book that followed it, Causality and
Chance.
Chance in Modern Physics, were there elements of that, of consciousness
Well,
mentioned?
mostly implicit. There I had the idea of this infinity of the universe, not really quantitative, but qualitative, infinity of levels of chance and necessity, to say that we look for laws that are necessary, like Newton's laws, and then we discover there are limits to them. These limits are due, necessity is what cannot be otherwise, and the limits are due to contingencies, what can be otherwise, that the thing is bound to depend on something else. Right? And, for example, if you have a feather floating in the wind, if a feather floated in a vacuum, were in a vacuum, it would fall. In the air, it's supported, and the slightest breeze will shift it this way and that way. See, it can be otherwise. In the vacuum, it falls necessarily. So by connecting with the broader context, you get contingency, and if these are very complicated and chaotic, you get chance, right, where you can't predict at all.
Right. Now, I know you connected those thoughts later on more specifically with respect to thought, but following the line of the development of consciousness, you went from writing that book to the theory
Yeah.
The special relativity book, if I recall.
Yes. Yeah, you see, the point about the causality book was that it brought up this potentially unlimited nature of reality, which would include consciousness, so it had something to do with that.
Yeah.
The idea being that consciousness would have no specifiable limits. Along with nature, I thought nature and consciousness were not only reflecting each other, but actually participating in each other.
Now, was that considered a unique perception at that time?
Well, I don't know how people considered it.
Well, I was wondering if you got any sort of response from them.
Well, I got some favorable reviews of the book, but I mean, they didn't really, that wasn't one of the main points stressed there.
Now, in the book that followed, I know there was an appendix to the special relativity.
Yes, and that was in the 60s, and I wrote a book on special relativity with an appendix which I devoted to perception, and I said that there was an analogy between perception and the way relativity treated things, that you couldn't, according to relativity, everything was related to the way that you interacted with it to observe it, you see, and also according to quantum mechanics. Right? Now, see, the point about perception is that it's a dynamic process, that we are constantly doing things and then seeing what happens, right? Handling objects and seeing what happens, or move. Everything must move. The eyeball must move in order to show light, to show form. And it's an active process. Right? Now, suppose we say we are looking at a circular object, solid, and as we walk around it, it really looks like an ellipse. You know, an artist draws it that way, with perspective. But we know by now that there are different appearances of the circle. We say really it's a circle which is solid, right?
Yeah.
So we could say the ellipse is their appearance and the circle is the essence, right? But then scientists came along and said that's only an appearance too, because the circle is made of a lot of atoms. It's really mostly empty space, atoms moving there. And therefore the atoms are the essence. Huh? So, but then others, later on, they came along and said these atoms are made of smaller objects, they're mostly empty space. Atoms too are appearances. And then these smaller objects were found to be made of quarks and so on. There were electrons and protons then made of quarks, and then they said these are fields. And see, they're looking for a theory of everything, but it keeps on receding, right? In other words, so I say that this suggests to me that everything is, even our thoughts are fundamentally appearances, how things appear to the mind, right? And we by combining many views of the object, we understand the object. Say in the stereoscope, 2 views give 3 dimensions. Is that clear?
Yeah.
So by combining many views of the circle, of this object, we get the notion it's a circle. By combining it with the scientific view, we get another view on it, a circle which is made of atoms. But then another view is that the atoms are constituted of smaller particles and so on. The more views we get that we can integrate and make coherent, the deeper our understanding of the reality is, right? But I say the reality, the essence would be called the true being. That really we never get hold of, right? It's unlimited. Everything, every view is limited. It's like a mirror looking this way. Many mirrors. Each one gives a view, a limited view. Right? But see, so I said theories don't give final true knowledge. They give a way of looking. The very word theoria in Greek means theater. It's sort of a theater of the mind that gives insight into the thing. Right? And therefore, so you can say that fundamentally science is involved in a perceptual enterprise, not primarily in gaining knowledge, though knowledge appears, but knowledge is a byproduct. And by understanding the thing, you can coherently, then our contact with it, as long as it is coherent, it shows that our understanding is correct. You see, we must distinguish between correct appearances and incorrect appearances or illusory, right?